The Endeavor tore through the alien atmosphere like a wounded predator, its hull glowing with streaks of fire as the control systems sputtered their final protests. Inside the cockpit, Frank's hands gripped the flight stick tightly, his knuckles pale against the strain. Sweat dripped down his temple, but his focus remained razor sharp. "Hold it together," he muttered through clenched teeth, though the groans of the failing ship seemed to mock his plea. Below, the planet's surface rose into view, a sea of glowing emerald forest, pulsating faintly as if alive. The controls locked, unresponsive, leaving Frank with nothing to do but brace as the ground surged closer. Impact was inevitable. The Endeavor hit the ground with a thunderous crash, shattering trees and digging a fiery scar through the jungle. The cockpit crumpled around Frank, and for a moment the world spun in chaotic blurs of green and flame. None. Silence. Frank blinked against the smoke, pain radiating from his ribs as he shifted in his seat. Broken glass glittered in the faint light, and the acrid scent of burning metal stung his nostrils. His body protested every movement, but he forced himself to crawl through a jagged tear in the ship's hull. His boots crunched against the soil, soft, damp, and strangely warm. The jungle greeted him like a living entity. Towering bioluminescent trees stretched upward, their glowing branches swaying in an unseen breeze. Tendrils of vine-like plants pulsed faintly, casting shifting hues of blue and green across the wreckage. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, a mix of clicks, chirps, and guttural growls that sent a chill down Frank's spine. He'd been to uncharted planets before, but this one felt alive in a way that defied explanation. "Survival first," Frank muttered, brushing off the haze of disorientation. He returned to the wreckage, scavenging what little he could. His medkit, portable scanner, and a half-melted blaster would have to suffice. Strapping the blaster to his hip, he turned toward the jungle, every instinct screaming caution. The jungle was humid and oppressive, the air tinged with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of Frank's throat. He moved cautiously, ears straining for any sound out of place. It came faster than he expected, a rustle in the foliage ahead. Frank froze, hand on his blaster. The leaves parted, and a figure stepped into view. She was unlike anything Frank had ever seen. Taller than him by a head, her sapphire blue skin shimmered in the jungle's faint glow, almost blending with the surroundings. Waves of fiery red hair fell over her shoulders, and her black eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his breath hitch. In her hands, she held a long staff carved with glowing runes. "A human," she said, her voice low and melodic, though her tone dripped with disdain. Her gaze swept over him, and the faintest hint of a smirk tugged at her lips. Small, weak, predictable, Frank straightened, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ribs. "And yet, here you are." Curious enough to stop and look. Her smirk deepened, though her sharp eyes remained guarded. "Curiosity is not interest," she replied coolly. "This jungle doesn't tolerate the weak, human. You won't last long." Frank met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Good thing I don't rely on the jungle's tolerance." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the jungle. Then she gestured with her staff, motioning toward the dense forest behind her. "Follow me. If you're lucky, you might survive the night." Frank hesitated. Her tone carried no warmth, only a detached indifference that sent a fresh wave of unease through him. But the jungle whispered its own warnings, and the faint sounds of distant growls left him little choice. Gritting his teeth, he fell into step behind her, blaster within reach. The path was barely a trail, more an uneven corridor carved through walls of glowing flora. Frank struggled to keep up with her long, deliberate strides, the faint metallic tang in the air growing stronger as they went deeper. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig or the rustle of unseen creatures. Every now and then, he caught her glancing back, her black eyes appraising him like a predator sizing up prey. "Why help me?" Frank finally asked, his voice breaking the oppressive quiet. "You don't seem the type to care much for outsiders." She didn't slow or turn. Her voice was steady, almost bored. "Help is a generous word. Think of it as an experiment." "I'm curious how long your kind can last here before the jungle swallows you whole," Frank snorted, though his grip on the blaster tightened. "Good to know I'm just a science project." She glanced over her shoulder, her smirk returning. "Don't flatter yourself. The foliage ahead shifted suddenly, and she raised a hand, signaling him to stop. From the shadows emerged a massive creature, its 6 legs rippling with muscle and its 4 glowing eyes locking onto them with predatory intent. A low growl rumbled through the air as the beast crouched, ready to pounce. Frank's hand flew to his blaster, but her sharp voice cut through the tension. "Don't move. Don't move," Frank hissed, incredulous. "That thing looks like it could eat me alive." "It will," she replied coldly, her staff beginning to hum faintly with energy. "If you panic." Before he could respond, she stepped forward, her movements fluid and deliberate. The creature growled, but she swung her staff in a wide arc, its runes glowing brighter as it emitted a pulse of energy. The beast hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing. With another sharp motion, she struck the ground with the staff, and the creature snarled before retreating into the shadows. Frank exhaled, lowering his blaster. Impressive. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You're alive." "That's more than I expected." Her tone carried a faint edge of mockery, but Frank let it pass. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steady. She hesitated, the faintest flicker of something crossing her gaze. "Keith, Frank," he said, extending a hand. Keith looked at it as though it were a foreign object, then shook her head with a wry smile. "You're not going to last long here, Frank," Frank smirked, despite himself. "Guess we'll find out." Keith turned without another word, her movements precise and predatory. Frank followed, questions swirling in his mind. Whoever this woman was, she was the only thing standing between him and the jungle. Survival would demand more than just strength. It would demand understanding of her, of this world, and of himself. The jungle's whispers grew louder as they walked, promising challenges that would test him in ways he could hardly imagine. The jungle opened to a sight Frank could never have imagined. The settlement rose before him like a fusion of nature and precision. Towering obsidian structures blended seamlessly with the glowing vines and pulsating flora that surrounded them. Light shimmered faintly around the buildings, casting soft hues of blue and green onto the jungle floor. Glyphs carved into the walls glowed faintly, their patterns shifting in a rhythmic dance. Keith walked ahead, her movements unhurried but purposeful, drawing stares from the alien women gathered in the settlement. They were tall, imposing figures, their sapphire blue skin glimmering in the dim light, and their fiery hair cascading down their back. Their sharp eyes shifted toward Frank with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some carrying mocking laughter that made Frank's jaw tighten. "Stay close," Keith said without turning, her tone devoid of warmth. "Not much of a welcoming committee," Frank muttered, keeping his voice low. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, and the sensation was far from comforting. One of the alien women stepped forward, taller and broader than the rest, her sharp smirk as cutting as her gaze. "Keith," she called, her voice dripping with mockery. "What's this? A pet?" "He looks like he'll snap under the weight of his own ego." Frank squared his shoulders, meeting her gaze. Small but sturdy, he shot back. "You'd be surprised what I can handle." The woman's smirk deepened, her eyes narrowing slightly with a flicker of amusement. "We'll see." Keith silenced the exchange with a single look, her sharp eyes cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. She gestured for Frank to follow, and the gathered women parted reluctantly, their stares lingering on him as he walked by. Frank followed Keith to the heart of the settlement, where a raised platform awaited. At its center floated a glowing cube, its surfaces twisting and shifting in intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. The faint hum it emitted sent a strange vibration through the air. "This is your first trial," Keith said, her voice calm but firm. "Solve the cube," Frank frowned, stepping closer to examine the object. "What's the catch?" "The catch," Keith said, crossing her arms, "is simple. If you fail, the settlement won't accept you. You'll be left to the jungle." Her tone left no room for argument, and her eyes locked onto his, unyielding. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a mix of skepticism and amusement. Frank glanced at Keith, then back at the cube. He knew this wasn't just about the trial, it was about proving himself to her, to these people, and maybe even to himself. Taking a deep breath, Frank stepped onto the platform. The cube's patterns twisted and turned chaotically, the glowing symbols disorienting in their complexity. Frank reached out, his fingers brushing the surface. The symbols pulsed, shifting in response to his touch. "Focus," Keith said from the edge of the platform, her voice low but steady. Frank tuned out the whispers and stares, concentrating solely on the task before him. The cube's movements were random at first, but as he watched, patterns began to emerge, hidden rhythms that spoke of logic beneath the chaos. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his hands moved instinctively, aligning the shifting fragments. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The whispers grew louder, some carrying faint chuckles of doubt. Frank ignored them, his mind locked onto the cube. Each twist of the glowing symbols brought him closer, but the pulsing patterns seemed to fight him at every turn. Kate watched intently, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Frank felt the weight of her gaze not as disdain, but as something sharper expectation. Finally, with a sharp click, the cube locked into place. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the platform, silencing the crowd. The hum of the cube ceased, and the symbols settled into a perfect alignment. Frank exhaled, stepping back as the light faded. His legs trembled slightly, but his grip on the platform's edge held steady. Kate stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she gave a slight nod. Not bad, human. Frank smirked, his confidence tempered by exhaustion. Told you I was sturdy. Keith's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, more acknowledgement than amusement. You've passed the first trial. Don't let it go to your head. The crowd murmured again, but this time the tone was different. The mockery had softened, replaced by curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of respect. Frank stepped off the platform, his breathing still uneven but his resolve stronger than ever. Kate gestured for him to follow, her stride purposeful as she led him away from the platform. There are more trials ahead, she said, her tone returning to its usual coolness. This was only the beginning. Frank matched her pace, his mind racing. The whispers of the crowd faded behind them as the settlement's glowing structures cast faint shadows over their path. You didn't think I'd make it, did you? He asked, glancing at her. Keith's gaze flicked toward him briefly, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. No, she admitted, but you surprised me. Don't expect that to happen again. Frank chuckled softly, the tension easing slightly as they walked. We'll see. Ahead, the jungle loomed once more, the faint hum of unseen creatures blending with the whispers of the settlement. Frank knew that this was far from over. Each step deeper into this alien world would test him not just his strength, but his will, his intelligence, and perhaps even his heart. And Keith, with her sharp eyes and guarded demeanor, would be watching every step of the way. Night fell over the settlement, draping the alien jungle in darkness. The faint glow of the bioluminescent vines illuminated the paths in soft hues of green and blue. Frank followed Kay through the winding trails, the tension between them palpable yet strangely comforting. The jungle whispered its presence around them, strange chirps, distant growls, and the soft rustle of unseen creatures. Ahead, a massive structure loomed, its obsidian walls etched with glowing glyphs that shifted as though alive. Two alien women stood guard at the entrance, their crimson hair braided with golden threads that caught the faint light. They nodded at Keith, their gazes flickering toward Frank with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. This is the Chamber of Trials, Keith explained as the heavy doors slid open. Her voice was calm but carried a weight that made Frank's pulse quicken. It's where we test resolve, connection, and worth. Few outsiders step inside, and none leave unchanged. The air inside was thick with energy, charged with a hum that seemed to resonate in Frank's chest. The chamber was vast, its circular walls lined with crystalline orbs that emitted a rhythmic glow. At the center stood a raised platform surrounded by towering pillars, their tops connected by beams of shifting light. Kate turned to face Frank, her dark eyes unreadable. This is your final trial, the rite of unity. Frank frowned, stepping closer to the platform. What does it involve? Kate hesitated for the briefest moment, her grip tightening on her staff. It's not just a test of skill or strength. It's about connection, understanding, proving that you can adapt not just to survive, but to belong. He studied her expression, catching a flicker of vulnerability beneath her sharp demeanor. And if I fail? Her smirk returned, but it was softer this time, almost reluctant. Then the jungle will have you, as it does with all who don't belong. Taking a deep breath, Frank stepped onto the platform. The pillars flared to life, beams of light forming an intricate web that surrounded him. A crystalline orb descended from above, hovering at eye level, its surface swirling with glowing patterns. Kate's voice broke the silence. Place your hands on the orb. It will show you what lies beneath the truth of who you are. Frank's fingers brushed the orb's surface, and the chamber was consumed by light. His mind was flooded with images, not of himself, but of Kate. He saw her as a young warrior, defying expectations and enduring grueling trials to prove her worth. He felt her frustration at being doubted, her determination to rise above it, and the loneliness she carried despite her strength. The images shifted, and Frank saw himself through her eyes, small, fragile, but defiant. He felt her initial disdain, the guarded curiosity that followed, and the reluctant respect that had begun to take root. The connection was raw and unfiltered, laying bare the vulnerabilities they both tried to hide. When the light faded, Frank was trembling. He looked at Case, who stood at the edge of the platform, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. "You saw me," she said quietly. Frank nodded. "And I think I understand you now." Kate held his gaze for a long moment before stepping forward. "You've passed the rite of unity," she said, her voice steady. "You're no longer just an outsider." She handed him a small, crystalline token, its surface glowing faintly with shifting patterns. "This marks you as one of us." As they stepped out of the chamber, the crowd gathered outside fell silent. The alien women, who had once dismissed Frank with mocking laughter, now regarded him with cautious respect. Kate raised her voice, addressing the settlement. "He has passed the trials. He is one of us." A ripple of approval spread through the crowd, their sharp gazes softening. The matriarch stepped forward, her presence commanding as she studied Frank with piercing eyes. "You've proven yourself human. Few outsiders earn this place. You've earned ours." Frank inclined his head, his voice steady. "Thank you." Later that evening, Keith led Frank to the outskirts of the settlement. The jungle stretched endlessly before them, its whispers filling the air. The glow of the vines cast faint shadows, and the hum of unseen creatures created a strange harmony. "When I first saw you," Keith began, her voice low, "I thought you were small, fragile, unremarkable." Frank raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I remember." Keith shook her head, her fiery hair catching the light. "I was wrong. You've proven yourself in ways I didn't think possible." Frank's smile widened, but there was a weight in his chest that he couldn't shake. "So what now?" he asked. Kate hesitated, her usual confidence faltering. "You've wanted to repair your ship since the moment you crashed here. Why would you stay?" Frank met her gaze, his tone steady. "Because I found something here I didn't expect: respect, purpose. And you—" Kate blinked, her composure slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of emotion in her gaze. "You're full of surprises, Frank," she said softly. Frank chuckled. "I aimed to be." The silence between them stretched, but it was no longer heavy. Instead, it carried the unspoken understanding they had forged through trials, battles, and shared vulnerability. For the first time in years, Frank felt truly at peace, not in the stars, but here, on this untamed planet with someone who challenged him and believed in him. The settlement glowed faintly in the distance, a reminder of how far he had come. Frank turned to Keith, his decision solidified. "I'm staying." Keith's eyes widened briefly, but she quickly masked her surprise with a faint smile. "Then you better keep proving yourself human." Frank grinned, the tension in his chest giving way to a sense of belonging. "Wouldn't have it any other way." Together they turned toward the jungle, the promise of new challenges ahead. Frank knew the path wouldn't be easy, but with Kate at his side, he was ready to face whatever this alien world had in store.